What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Nioh 2. The sequel, of course, to the original Nioh, both of which being technically Souls-like with a mix of somewhat Diablo-esque mechanics, though I would say both this game and the original are probably the only Souls-likes that I think have successfully managed to become their own separate thing, and Nioh 2 in particular really expands on a lot of the systems present in Nioh 1. But before we dive into all that, just to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything I cover, there's a link in the description below, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of Nioh 2 in particular, the achievements cover most of the game. Really, the only thing that isn't covered is the last New Game Plus cycle, Dream of the Nioh, and the end-game content that also unlocks alongside that New Game Plus mode called the Underworld. And technically, I don't think there's any achievements for the third New Game Plus, Dream of the Wise, either. With that in mind, though, I did experience all of those things. Obviously, I don't think a review like this would have been complete without talking about them. And much like Nioh 1, the only thing I really haven't done here is completely explored the Underworld portion of the game, or the Abyss as it was known in Nioh 1, as it's meant to be a sort of endless grind of content if you want to keep playing the game. Though it doesn't offer too much in the way of new things, outside of a great way to farm gear and levels, etc., if you want to continue playing after all the New Game Plus cycles. No matter how you slice it though, Nioh 1 is a very large game, so I wanted to touch a little bit on how much I have been playing it, and overall I spent about 130 hours with it in total. A single run of the base game is likely to take you around the 30 to 50 hour range, kind of just depending on your own pace and how familiar you are with these kind of games. It took me about 41 hours to be specific for the initial playthrough. New Game Plus cycles are easier to deal with as you've already seen all the content more than likely, and you simply need to run through, get your gear, and you don't even have to do all of the individual missions to do that, only about roughly 40%, so you can burn through them decently quickly if that is your goal. And I got to Dream of the Nioh in particular probably about 110-ish hours in, and spent another 20 or so hours just kind of messing around with some of that in-game content to speak on it a little more, which I mostly mentioned because while you can spend a significant amount of time in these areas, a lot of that will see you running through the same types of content over and over again, which is, I would say, one of the areas that this game doesn't wildly improve over Nioh 1, though it is a little better in some regards, such as a better variety of enemies. Which brings me to a quick overview of this review. Generally, Nioh 2 really pushes its unique approach to combat and sort of, again, Diablo-esque mechanics to new heights, and in many ways the combat is vastly improved even from the first game, in my opinion. But much like the first game, it also carries forward some other issues at the same time, such as bosses that aren't really memorable and you'll see over and over and over again, and a lot of reused mission areas and assets, and while a great many of the main missions and things are new areas completely, it's not uncommon for the submissions and the DLC in particular to simply reuse missions, that is to say layouts and bosses and things from the first game actually, which felt a little underwhelming for what was supposed to be new content. I also think it's a shame that it didn't bring forward some quality of life changes that could have been used from the first game, like honestly just a loot filter like you often see in ARPGs these days would have been very welcome. So in many ways it improves, and in other ways I would say it stays the same. Now that brings me to my technical state. This game is not particularly old, so if you're worried about running it, at least at the time of this video, that's really not much of an issue, especially if you're playing on PC compared to the first one. The first game had a problem with hard-coded controls, meaning that the button prompts that were shown to you were always for controller, and even then only one specific type of controller, and Nioh 2 actually has full keyboard and mouse control, and while many people prefer playing these types of games with a controller, I am keyboard and mouse all day, so having that fully integrated control scheme is vastly improved from the first game, and in that way I think technically speaking it's a much better game already, but otherwise there's not much to report. Looking through some user reviews here and there, I see the occasional relatively recent mention of crashes, but I can't say that I experienced anything like that. It ran very smoothly for me, which isn't a huge surprise as it released back in 2020 originally and it came to PC in 2021. And what's more, the recommended specs for running this on PC are relatively low, much like the first game as well, well, which makes even hardware like the Steam Deck capable of running this quite well. That, though, brings me to the story setup and my thoughts on it. So, a fair bit to say here, though broadly speaking, before we talk specifics, I would say Nioh 2's story is told better than the original Nioh, but it's a worse story overall, if that makes sense. Nioh 1's story is much more interesting. It wasn't told all that well, which I talked about in that review. Nioh 2, on the other hand, has a much more cohesive story. It's a lot easier to understand what is going on. It's just drastically less interesting than the original. Nioh 2, though, is set in Japan during the Sengoku period, specifically the late 1500s, though for the most part it is a prequel to Nioh. A few of the last missions do actually take place after Nioh. This time around, however, we are able to make our own character, which is a mostly cosmetic choice, though towards the end of this tutorial you'll have the option to make a couple small decisions to get your build started in the right direction. More on that in a second. Because regardless of the character you create, you play as a half yokai individual referred to as the shiftling. Your mother was a yokai and your father just a regular man, and this has allowed our character the ability to shift into different yokai forms, which is central to our role in the story. The game begins after we wake up from a recurring nightmare, save a villager, and find a letter telling us to meet them at a nearby village. After clearing that first initial level, you'll run into one of the other main characters of the game, Tokichiro, and honestly I'm probably going to butcher some of these names, I apologize in advance, and this character becomes our close friend and leads us through the story of the main game as our characters search for the power of Amrita, the plot stones that fuel all these things with the yokai and other elements that make up this world. It is in the course of seeking the Amrita, or the spirit stones, that we run into all sorts of other historical figures like Oda Nobunaga and many other recurring characters from both the first game and just general Japanese history. This, however, of course leads to a grander plot that I would say becomes mostly a bit more clear in the end game, but focuses on a lot of the infighting that defined this era of Japanese history, but of course with the dark fantasy spin of all the yokai and terrible monstrosities roaming the lands at the same time. Now, that's about as much as I want to say for the story, because anything else is honestly kind of a spoiler, and it is difficult to connect what happens in the late game of this one without talking about what happens in Nioh as well, which is honestly all a bit long-winded. Though, as I mentioned earlier, it is a better told story than Nioh 1's. That is to say, it is much easier to understand what is happening, because Nioh 1 had the bad habit of jumping around several decades of time in history, throwing you into cutscenes where you have no idea who anybody is, whereas Nioh 2 very specifically introduces characters, explains the situation, makes sense from cutscene to cutscene, even when it is advancing in time. Now, oftentimes, whenever I mention this, I will see people talk about how, to someone who knows the historical figures of Japan, this would make more sense as it is effectively an alternative history thing, but I would push back against that and say that you could make a story about George Washington and the American Founding Fathers, and I might know who that character is, but if you introduce a subplot with dark fantasy elements that have nothing to do with history, and then jump that character around several decades, introducing his lieutenants and things, I'm still not going to have any idea what you're talking about, even if I know who that character is. So frankly, I don't think that defense holds weight, which I imagine is why they went to greater lengths here in Nioh 2 to make the story actually make sense, which I was a pretty big fan of, and I think it paid off for them. It's just a shame that the actual story isn't quite as interesting as the originals. Now, from there, let's talk a little bit about character creation. Nioh 2 does feature a primarily cosmetic character creation, which lets you customize and change all sorts of elements of your character, their normal stance, their tattoos, facial features, scarring, all sorts of hair options. In fact, one of my favorite things about this character creator is that you can pick from several different hair options and then adjust the lengths of individual portions of it, as your base hair and your bangs are considered separate things in the character creator, and you can adjust the length of each one. So as far as cosmetic character creators go, this was a really good one, which admittedly I was not expecting when playing this particular game, especially after the original had that set protagonist with William. And while their later title, Wo Long, also had a similar system, it was just curious to me to see how advanced this already was. Now, probably the coolest thing about the cosmetic character creator, though, is that if you recall, we are not simply a regular human, but we are half yokai, and this involves transforming, which we'll talk about, into 3 different potential yokai forms. And you can actually customize a little bit of those individual forms. So even those forms you transform into are a little bit customizable, which I thought was a really cool touch that I honestly wasn't expecting. So surprisingly, I really enjoyed this cosmetic character creation. I think they did a tremendous job with it, which is bizarre given how it doesn't have that much to do with the rest of the game. Now, another really great thing I think this game does is our next subject, which is the tutorial. You see, a problem Nioh 1 had is that it has this relatively unique and in-depth combat system and then doesn't bother to teach you any of it until well after the start of the game, which is classic for Souls-likes, but it's a very poor move on their part in my opinion. Nioh 2, on the other hand, right after character creation, throws you into a quick tutorial to teach you the absolute basics, giving you a few different starting weapons that determine your starting stats, basically what that weapon happens to scale off of, teaches you the basic combos, and then goes over how to shift into yokai form and explain the new yokai shift mechanic that replaced the living weapon mechanic from the original. And you'll also pick your guardian spirit, which is a recurring thing we'll talk a little bit about later. And then when you're ready and you are content with your understanding of the tutorials, you're then given the option to start the game. That is a much better way to approach these combat systems than what we saw in the previous entry, and honestly to this day most Souls-likes at large. So I think they do a great job of tutorializing you this time around, which is one of the many ways that Nioh 2 improves over the original title. But that brings me to difficulty, or more specifically, New Game Plus. Now, if you're familiar with the games from Team Ninja, this won't come as a surprise to you, but I do think it's worth mentioning because it does contain where the game gets a little bit unfun for me personally. Basically, after you beat the game a single time, or that is to say what most people are going to do, you're only really getting started with the rest of the game, as the base game sees you burning through equipment, learning the levels, and not really dealing with a lot of the late game itemization, specifically because it's simply not available yet. But after you beat the game for the first time, you'll unlock the initial New Game Plus cycle known as Dream of the Strong. After you complete that, you unlock Dream of the Demon, then Dream of the Wise, and then Dream of the Nioh. Each of these getting progressively harder and adding new mechanics. Dream of the Strong, the first one, isn't that crazy. It mostly just replaces enemy layouts, so you'll face stronger enemies earlier, and some of the bosses and things in general are of course stronger. Dream of the Demon is where things start getting interesting because this is where they introduce cursed enemies, which are pumped up purple tinged enemies that have unique variables that if you hit them with a burst counter, which we'll talk about in a bit, can be temporarily removed, though generally these enemies are stronger and have more health on top of these things, but they also drop great loot. Now, Dream of the Strong and the Demon introduce Divine gear. Divine is the green gear that can be soul matched and upgraded as you go, which we'll talk more about in the progression systems, only for Dream of the Wise and Dream of the Nioh to throw a lot of that away and start again with ethereal items, which are the same thing but a stronger version, that come with their own set bonuses that are generally referred to as graces, as all of the sets have grace in their name, and functionally they work pretty similar. Now, another thing Dream of the Wise and Dream of the Nioh do is increase your level caps up to a maximum of like 750, and even after that you can continue to upgrade your focuses, which is just extra little generic level increases as you go even farther, but it mostly just increases things like your life instead of continued weapon scaling. So while the game does not have a traditional difficulty slider or anything, it does feature those multiple New Game Plus cycles, each one of which adds new mechanics as you go, which is very par for the course for this particular developer. They've done that in a lot of their games. But the main thing I want to mention here is that for me, this is an almost identical case to Nioh 1, where Dream of the Wise is where I was having the most fun fighting smaller regular enemies, if you will. Those feel great on Dream of the Wise. The problem is, starting in Dream of the Demon and then gets really bad in Dream of the Nioh and Dream of the Wise, is that they continue to just bump up the health of bosses to extraordinary amounts. It's not uncommon for late game boss fights to last like 10-15 minutes, where it feels like you're barely dealing any damage, and on Dream of the Demon and Dream of the Wise, that's manageable if you're geared up. And Dream of the Nioh is where it starts to get unfun for me because everything is capable of killing you very quickly, at least as far as the bosses go. And while this can be mitigated by getting up to the very high level areas, and of course gearing out appropriately, it can be overcome, but for me that's where the grind and continued running through of the same areas over and over again starts to weigh pretty heavy on me, and I start to have less and less fun as I go. So while for the most part I enjoy those systems, I think think the health bloat on bosses especially gets just outrageous when you get to the Dream of the Nioh, to the point where the game just stops being fun for me personally, at least. But that is exactly how I felt about Nioh again, so not necessarily a big surprise, I would say. But then we have progression systems. Now, I want to begin this particular section with mentioning that I covered a lot of Nioh 1's progression and combat systems very, very thoroughly in that original video, and most of that is simply carried forward here. So I'm not going to go over the basics in like super great detail. I'm just going to give a quick synopsis, and I mostly want to focus on the things that are new, or at least really important to know and just need to be quickly mentioned. As again, fundamentally, most of these systems are the same as Nioh, as you would expect from a sequel, I would imagine. With that in mind, progression system-wise, we first have our level ups. This works the same way it does in basically every Souls-like. As you kill things, you'll get experience. In this case, it is Amrita. If you die, it drops on the ground. If you die again before you can get it, you lose it, and if you get back to your rest point, in this case shrines, you can spend that Amrita to level your character up. Each individual stat is associated with a primary or weapon scaling, if you will, effect, and a secondary effect. Diminishing returns set in on your secondary effect pretty quickly. In fact, you've seen the bulk of the secondary effect by the time an individual stat gets to like 30 to 40. However, what remains constant is your weapon scaling. Every single stat you see here affects weapon scaling for one weapon or another, which remains linear as you go. So the higher it is, the more weapon damage you will deal with that particular type of weapon. You'll also gain small passive benefits to things like your life as you level up generally. That way everyone kind of meets certain minimums based on the level you are. As you run through New Game Plus cycles, the caps on these will increase, with the maximum level cap being about 750 and the initial cap on your stats being 99, but during Dream of the Wise that gets up to a maximum of 200. Then we have your gear. Fundamentally, this works the same as it did in Nioh 1 as well. The first couple New Game Plus cycles give you Divine Gear, which also has set bonuses. You'll combine those to get the set you want with Divine Gear that can upgrade farther by combining bits of Divine Gear together to increase the plus modifier next to their name up to the cap for that particular New Game Plus. You're going to do this through soul matching at the blacksmith, which is also what you'll do for the ethereal gear, the next rank of gear that you'll unlock in Dream of the Wise and Dream of the Nioh, which also has those graces I mentioned, which are the best set bonuses. You also upgrade those via soul matching once you find them, which is going to be done at the blacksmith. The blacksmith can also remodel and temper your weapons. Tempering will allow you to swap out individual stats, and remodeling will actually allow you to adjust the exact weapon scaling of an individual weapon. Most weapons scale off of up to 3 different stats, and remodeling it allows you to adjust which one it scales off of the most, which is especially handy if you are maxing out one stat in particular. Then you have your proficiencies and skills. Much like Nioh 1, as we use individual disciplines such as weapons, ninjutsu, magic, or in this case our yokai powers, you'll gain proficiency in them, and upon ranking them up, you will receive a proficiency point, and you can also receive locks of hair throughout the game that serve as basically extra proficiency points for any given one of these. This is how you are going to learn your new skills with all of your weapons, which allows you to perform different combos. It's also where you'll pick up ninjutsu and magic abilities, which allow you to cast magic and use things like bombs, shurikens, and caltrops respectively. And then we have samurai points and yokai points. Samurai points are kind of just general passive abilities to your overall ability in combat, which can be great. And then your yokai abilities directly affect your ability in your yokai shift forms. So as you use different types of combat, you level these up. Some of them require you to complete special training missions before you can advance them, which is the case for most everything on the skill menu. And the main thing here to know is that there are new weapon types, which we'll talk about in the combat section, and they expanded quite a bit of the magic and ninjutsu skill trees. So there's a lot more there to choose from, but generally even the stuff you're not using is going to have passives you want, and you're likely going to accumulate some proficiency points even if you don't mean to, and that's likely what you should aim if you don't use it a ton. For instance, I don't use the ninjutsu a whole bunch with the way I like to play the game, but there are still passives in there that I want to grab anyway, and if you play all the way up to Dream of the Nioh, simply by getting extra points from the locks of hair, you'll likely come close to maxing a lot of these out anyway if you don't do it outright. But realistically, if you've played Nioh 1, you'll feel very comfortable with this, and if Nioh 2 is your first Nioh title, it shouldn't be too difficult to get into, as there is a small tutorial for even this, so something to keep in mind. Now, new to Nioh 2 though, we have the Soul Core system. Every type of enemy has a chance to drop a Soul Core, which is where this game's new take on Guardian Spirits come in. Nioh 2 allows you to pick up all sorts of guardian spirits as you play through the game and interact with them throughout the story. You'll eventually get access to them, and you can equip a guardian spirit. The guardian spirit determines what type of yokai shift you can use: brute, feral, or phantom. In addition to that though, each guardian spirit can be attuned to 3 different soul cores from enemy drops. These soul cores are going to give you access to a bunch of passive stats and also allow you to use some of the abilities that enemy has in combat, which means that not only are you shifting into yokai form, you can also use some of your enemy's abilities based on which one of these you have slotted, which is another form of character progression that I think is pretty cool, mostly because how you interweave individual yokai abilities into your regular everyday approach to combat can change how you play quite a bit. And then another big section of progression is the titles system. Basically, as you do stuff in game, you'll earn individual titles, which gives you reputation points that you can spend that lets you increase certain passive abilities in relation to like how long you can stay in your yokai shift form, how much Amrita you're gathering, individual bonuses to things like life or your stamina, which is a nice touch, but doesn't do a ton overall unless you're playing the game for an exceptionally long time and they start to stack up. That though brings us to the gameplay and the world. So, basically identical to Nioh 1 here as well. You have the individual world maps, which are divided into sections of the game. Each of these maps or periods that you'll be running through the game in contain a variety of main story missions, sub-missions, and what are called online missions. The online missions don't count towards basically anything completion-wise, but they are great places to grind against specific enemies to get loot. Submissions are effectively side stories that you do not need to complete to advance the story, but will offer a bunch of rewards and do count towards the progression of the New Game Plus cycles later. And basically, from this map, you'll decide which level or mission you want to take on based on what's available to you at the time, though it's worth mentioning there actually are items hidden around the world map this time as well. Every once in a while, you'll see your cursor turn red and you can click on that and it'll give you a little item, and also explain a little bit of history about that exact point on Japan's map, which I thought was a nice little touch. Now, once you're actually in a given mission, you'll run through, find all sorts of collectibles you can find, such as Kodama, who then head back to the shrines, which act as your resting points, where you'll rest up and recover all your health, but enemies respawn. The Kodama in particular, though, you want to find and send back to the shrine, because doing so allows you to activate a blessing based on how many you found per act that gives you extra bonuses to things you might want, which can be pretty substantial once you find all of them. The progression on that also persists through New Game Plus, by the way, which is very nice. Here in Nioh 2, though, we also get the addition of the Kodama Bazaar. You see, you're going to be finding a lot of loot in these missions as you run through, kill enemies. It's a bit of a loot extravaganza, and you're not going to need most of it. So one thing you can do is offer it at the shrines to the Kodama, who then give you Amrita in exchange for it. But they also give you Divine Rice, which allows you to purchase things from their bazaar, which is a nice way to replenish your consumables very, very easily, such as your ammunition for your ranged weaponry, which can keep you in stock on things with much less of a hassle than normal. And much like any Souls-like really, as we explore these missions, we'll be backtracking a little bit, unlocking shortcuts, allowing us to traverse to places we might have died that much quicker, as we try to fight enemies, clear bosses, and for the most part, it's what you would expect from this game. But there is a couple of things I want to mention. For starters, Dark Realms, which are new to this game. Occasionally, throughout levels, especially main missions, you'll run into Dark Realms, or Yokai Zones. These areas are maintained by a singular, strong entity. Sometimes this is an object, not an actual yokai, or just a strong yokai in general. In order to clear this area, which causes you to regenerate your stamina at a reduced rate, you need to kill that individual, which is usually stronger than it would normally be, especially once you get to the later New Game Plus cycles. These zones also have the habit of blocking progress in some way. They can block chests, which have items you might need in them. They might have items in the yokai zone. You don't necessarily need to clear them every time, but generally they're a hindrance to you in some way, so you need to find ways to clear them despite having reduced effectiveness in those zones, which I thought was an interesting take on mixing up the overall gameplay element of a game like Nioh without fundamentally altering the experience in any way, and it gives a little bit more nuance to the yokai zones from the original game that are also in this one, which are simply small areas of effect that get dropped on the ground by yokai that reduce your stamina as well, which I thought was pretty cool. And then we have the actual mission structure. Now, one thing Nioh 1 struggles with is that the levels aren't exactly great. They have a tendency to be fairly small, but there are tons of shortcuts all over the place leading back to places you just didn't need a shortcut for, and it didn't make a lot of sense. Nioh 2 does much better in that regard. There are fewer and more meaningful shortcuts, and progress feels a little more deliberate and thought through, frankly. And while the mission structure of this game doesn't lend it the impact that things like that have on something like a traditional Souls-like, it's still nice to see that they cleaned that up a little bit here. I wouldn't say it's incredible or anything, but it is a bit better than the original, which was nice. And the only thing to mention after that is simply the Twilight missions. Returning from the first game, after you get to a certain point in the game, you unlock Twilight missions, which lets you take on extra hard versions of individual missions, hoping to get some better gear or rewards as a result. Much like the first game, I didn't find it necessary to really do these, but they exist if you want to. Much like my Nioh 1 review though, I do want to dedicate a portion of this video specifically to the actual bosses themselves, as they are kind of the big set pieces you'll be fighting against as you go. And again, a repeat of Nioh here is that so many of the bosses in this game are incredibly underwhelming, and you're going to be fighting them repeatedly. Throughout the game, and especially its DLCs, there are a few good bosses, I think, but most of the ones I thought were really cool and were fun to fight were to be found in the DLC specifically. Most of the main game ones, the first time I ran through the game on the base difficulty, were just incredibly easy to kill. In fact, I no-hit the last boss without even meaning to. And sure, I play a lot of these games and review them, but my first run through the game, almost every boss had me going, wow, that kinda sucked, to be honest. And while I did get stuck on one or two of them that were simply more difficult to deal with the build I like to play through this game with, which I'm sure you've seen on screen up to this point, which takes a bit more of a brute force approach to any real finesse that the combat system offers, I still think a lot of the bosses are disappointing, especially because most of them are either just straight up human enemies or humanoid enemies, which are easy to overwhelm with your abilities. That is until you get to the DLC, which we'll save for that section of the video, honestly, where I do think the bosses got a lot better and a lot more challenging, and actually made me think about how I was playing a substantial amount more. Now, once you get past the base difficulty into the New Game Plus cycles, enemies can actually start having new movesets that they can employ as well that can shake things up a little bit. But I think their solution to the late game is simply not making these bosses more interesting, but rather pumping up their health to outrageous numbers, which still doesn't feel great. Which means that for a game that focuses on its bosses, a lot of them just didn't feel fun. Even if they did manage to vastly increase the variations that you'll be fighting. There's a lot more bosses in this one, and there's a lot more of yokai to fight as well. So whereas the first game had limited variety, this game did at least improve upon that aspect of it. Another thing I want to mention for the bosses, because that's mostly where it came up in Nioh 1, is the sloth spell. You see, Nioh 1 had a bad habit of pitting you in like multiple boss fights. That is to say, it would be like two bosses on you, and one of the easiest ways to deal with that, in fact I would borderline say it was almost necessary, was to use a spell called Sloth, which slows enemies down for a period of time, so you could simply focus on one of them at a time before you just got destroyed. That is vastly less necessary in Nioh 2 here, because they don't push multiple bosses on you like that nearly as much. It happens like once. So using things like Sloth never felt as necessary as simply learning enemy patterns, learning to burst counter, and just simply use the abilities the game offers you, and not resorting to what can at times feel like cheap tactics to get through what feels like cheap fights. So I do like that they refined a lot of that, even if the bosses themselves aren't deeply interesting to me. Though that does roll pretty naturally into the combat section. Now, combat in Nioh 1 and Nioh 2 is a dense system, and I talked about it at length and how a lot of the individual little parts of it worked in Nioh 1. So again here, I'm trying to focus on the stuff that is new to Nioh 2 specifically. Nioh 2 has a ton of new weapons, and a lot of them are really fun to mess around with. Some of this stuff was added by DLC, etc. later down the line, so if you're playing the complete edition, which is the main edition you'll find around these days, you'll have a lot of this just normally. But first up, there are the fist weapons. Now, talking about Nioh 2, I heard a lot of people say that they would recommend the fist weapons to new players, which I would say is mostly true. They feel a little more natural in what you might expect of an action game and its combos, and they're also very, very quick. So it's easy to jump into the fist weapons and be, I would say, pretty proficient with them, kind of just right out of the gate very quickly. And honestly, sometimes it's just fun to punch a demon in the face, even if it can seem a little silly at times. Though it does have some really cool combos that I thought were fun to mess around with. Now, of the new weapons from Nioh 2, the split staff is probably my favorite. A staff that can break apart and change into a slightly more ranged weapon has a lot of really fun combos. The, I would say, base attack patterns of it have a lot to offer, but what I liked about this one is just that it offered a lot of mobility while still having a lot of fun combos at the same time. In fact, one of its combos allowed you to sort of jump into the air and over enemies, which was just a ton of fun to mess around with. And I've seen some people do some pretty broken things, I would say, with the split staff, and while I personally prefer just the regular old axe, split staff was very, very fun. And in a somewhat close second to that, we then have the switch glaive, the sort of magic weapon that you're going to use if you have a high magic stat, has some really fun combos and just a really cool look. It's essentially a scythe, and it was simply a lot of fun to swing this thing around. It has a lot of really fast combos despite the weapon's size, which make it feel really fun to play as you're hitting enemies very, very quickly. And if I'm being honest, it just kind of looks badass, so there is that. And then last but not least, we have the hatchets, another dual wield option that is a ton of fun. This one is actually cool because there are combos that allow you to throw the hatchets as part of the combo, which I had a lot of fun messing around with, which felt like it gave me a lot of cool options to focus on breaking an individual enemy's guard so you could perform a grapple attack, which does a bunch of extra damage. And the hatchets in particular, I would say, felt like a weapon that you could really move around with a ton. A lot of its combos have to deal with, again, throwing the hatchets themselves or simply maneuvering the enemy in ways that allowed you more mobility than you might initially expect. So they were fun to mess around with in a surprising way to me, as I wasn't really expecting to like them, to be honest. My point is that all of the new weapons added in Nioh 2 feel great to play, offer you some new options in general, and considering the already very robust combat system at play, was a fantastic touch. Then we have our yokai shift, which allows us to turn into one of 3 different types of yokai: brute, feral, or phantom, each of which has their own skill set and approach to combat based upon, of course, what kind of guardian spirit you have equipped to you. As you participate in combat, kill enemies, and pick up Amrita, this fills your Amrita gauge, and when it's maxed out, which is the guardian spirit icon near your health and stamina gauge there, you can activate it to shift into your yokai form. And this is going to allow you to, similarly to the living weapon system from Nioh 1, attack the enemy, deal a bunch more damage while being immune to their damage yourself, but hits and attacks on your end will shorten the length of time you're allowed to stay in this phase. But the trick is, you can still use your yokai abilities in this form, which are gotten from your soul cores, which is important because those abilities knock Amrita out of the enemy you're fighting, specifically other yokai. And if you time this right, you can actually stay in your yokai shift for a very long time, which is useful for other large yokai bosses. And given that each form has its own different playstyle, and what abilities you're using will also change, there's a fair amount of variance to how this is going to actually affect any given situation for your particular case, because every form has its pros and cons, if you will. While it's hardly the recommended one, I personally really enjoy the brute yokai form because it kind of matches my brute force playstyle that I like to approach these games with, as we simply need to hit the enemy as much as possible. But the feral one is more about agility, allows you to dodge while attacking, and then the phantom form gives you a bit of ranged option as you can throw your weapons with it, which gives it a bit of versatility in compared to something like the brute, who can mostly just hit enemies very, very hard, but does allow you to, say, parry, for instance. But then we have our burst counter, which is also dependent on your guardian spirit and the yokai form that it will give you. Enemies can flash red, which is a big wind-up attack, and if you time it right based on your individual yokai form, you can then perform a burst counter, which will then inflict a bunch of stamina or ki damage to the enemy, which is obviously very useful because it gives you a chance to perform a grapple that much more quickly. Now, brute is generally considered the hardest one to pull off, as it is effectively a parry of these moves, and because different enemies perform different burst counterable moves, let's say, some particular forms of burst counter are more effective than others against certain types of enemies. So where brute is a parry, the phantom version of a burst counter is actually a guard. You simply need to guard against the attack, and what's more, the phantom has the quickest recovery time if you fail. And given that you're generally going to be trying to block a lot of this stuff anyway, people really like the phantom version of this. Feral, on the other hand, allows you to do a rapid dodge out of the way that leaves a sort of image of you behind, and if the enemy hits that image with their attack, then they are effectively burst countered. And there are going to be individual attacks that are easier to hit with each one of those, basically. So there's no, I would say, one right answer, but there are some that are easier to use than others. But like I said, myself, I really preferred the brute form, probably because I played so much Wo Long from them, which was all about parrying, and that brute form kind of leaned into that. In fact, it works pretty similarly to Wo Long's parry system, I would say. So that was a little more what I was comfortable with, surprisingly, despite it not being the generally recommended option. Honestly, though, in comparison to the living weapon system that this replaces, I would say I like this a bit more. I think there's more versatility. You get to be more choosy about exactly how you want to approach it. There's simply more options on your end rather than just an element, and it functionally performs the same thing. I will say that it can take a little getting used to, and with a game that already has so much going on combat-wise, adding even more options could be a little touchy. I could see some people basically getting tired of trying to memorize what to do versus what attack, that kind of thing. It's a lot to keep in mind, frankly, but overall, compared to the living weapon system, I do think it's an improvement. And another cool thing about combat is that in addition to your Amrita gauge, you'll also be filling up your anima gauge as you attack enemies. Your anima is what you're going to use to activate your yokai abilities, which can be done regardless of whether or not you are in your yokai shift form. These abilities, pulled from your soul cores attached to your guardian spirit, allow you to perform the moves that enemies often use against you, and in some instances, I had a ton of fun with these. They usually do a ton of stamina damage to enemies they hit, and given that there's so many yokai in this game that you can pull from and steal a move from, basically, it really can add a ton to your build and what it does. Probably the most useful thing I could tell you about it, though, is that it simply makes strings of combos a little bit easier, if that makes sense, because while you are turned into a yokai to perform these abilities, your stamina actually recovers regardless of what you're doing. So for instance, if you pull off a long attack combo, you can then shift into your yokai abilities, which will then restore your stamina and allow you to continue a combo afterwards. So there are situations where these yokai abilities will allow you to pull off very long combos, which can feel really great to do. Though you do have to keep in mind that while you are performing a yokai ability, you are not immune to damage. Enemies can still hit you, which is the thing you have to be worried about, because you can very much so die during these. And while that covers, I think, most of what is new to Nioh 2 specifically, there's still a few things I want to mention. For starters, Nioh 1's combat system was insane. Every weapon has different stances, which come with its own customizable combos, which means every weapon is as basic or as complicated as you want to make it. They have an insane amount of customizable options here in Nioh 2, where they've added so many weapons, which come with their own combos and stances, which leans into the key pull system and everything, and I'll fully admit that I am not the best at this system. Despite having gotten 100% on both of these games, I mostly take a brute force approach to these things because I'm not very good at the constant stance shifting into different weapon combos you can pull off, and you can watch some videos of people doing that on YouTube. It's some truly impressive stuff. Whereas somebody like myself, I pretty much just find the thing I like and stick to it. But Nioh 2 in particular, with its yokai shift and its yokai abilities, had me thinking of ways to break myself out of that rut in fun ways while still being very familiar with the systems overall. So while I fully admit there are people much, much better at the system than I am, it is a remarkable improvement on an already really great system, which is the main thing I want to get across. But realistically, I think some people might still struggle, so there is another thing I want to mention. If you're fighting any big yokai enemy specifically, you can use clay bells or summons. Clay bells will summon in these cat-like yokai called scampuses, and you can have up to 3 of them with you at a time. The reason you might want to do this is because having 3 of them with you will absolutely destroy an enemy's stamina bar, allowing you to grapple them much more rapidly. On basically everything but Dream of the Nioh, as long as you don't die instantly, having 3 of those cats with you is like pressing an I win button. It makes so many bosses an absolute joke. So if you're struggling with a few things like I did, especially on some of the DLC bosses, which we're going to talk about, they are a great option to help you get through those things. And if that's not working, you can also summon in help. The blue graves you'll find in individual missions allow you to summon in help via other characters, but controlled by AI, by simply spending an item. Now, some of these blue graves that you'll find simply are deliberately placed. They usually come with a light blue nameplate, and that's how you know they are specifically an AI character, not someone's placed blue grave. Another option is to summon help directly from a shrine. You can summon a visitor in much the same way, but summoning a visitor allows you to play with an actual real person, which is a distinction I failed to make when initially playing this game, before playing the game with a real person for almost an hour before I had realized what I'd actually done, which was kind of funny. But my point being, the biggest thing I could tell you about combat with Nioh is that there are certainly parts of it I would consider unfair, with bosses and combos and getting hit by very cheap attacks, but the main thing to keep in mind is that you also have a ton of very cheap options available to you should you choose to invoke them. And while if you're skilled enough at the game, I don't think you necessarily need to take that route, it is there for those people who need it, and sometimes that includes myself, frankly. But when all else fails, use those clay bells. They will be a lifesaver for you in New Game Plus especially. Now I want to talk a little bit about the DLC. This game got 3 DLCs, and the most important thing to know about them is that they actually are what added the New Game Plus cycles to the game beyond just the first New Game Plus, so they are necessary to handle a lot of what I'm talking about here. But given that you have the complete edition available these days, that's likely what you're going to grab anyway, so it's not a huge deal. Now, the DLCs themselves concern themselves with time travel. Basically, every single one of them sends you to a different period of Japan's history through, just general yokai magic, basically. And personally, I think the story of them is very weak. It actually tries to connect to the main story in a way that feels incredibly forced, and story-wise, I think it actually drops the ball on the already pretty low bar I had for the story to begin with. And beyond the story, gameplay-wise, these are mostly just more of the same. More side missions, more stories, more things to interact with, more bosses to take on. So in that way, I wouldn't say the DLC is anything remarkable so much as simply more of the same. But I do want to talk about the bosses of the DLC specifically, because this is where I would say they really shine. Despite the base game's bosses being mostly unremarkable, I loved a lot of the bosses from the DLC. A lot of them were incredibly difficult, provided a serious challenge that forced me to think about how I was approaching the game, and ultimately made me, I think, a bit of a better player as a result. Mostly that it was okay to utilize items and take control of various effects to make things easier for myself, such as the Lightning Gods of Yomi boss that uses all sorts of elemental effects, mostly lightning, which slows your character down, and if you're not using something to counter that, which there is an item that will do that, you're going to have an incredibly bad time. And given that most of those enemies also have a much more elaborate set of combos to learn and watch out for, they just felt more satisfying to fight overall. Mostly because it was the first time through my initial run of the game that I was fighting a boss that I felt like actually was fighting me back, which is what I liked most about them. And that's to say nothing of all the new enemy and yokai types that were added by the DLCs as well, and when you get to the later New Game Plus cycles, these new enemies actually get cycled into the regular game as well. That is to say, your main story missions, etc. will be sprinkled in with yokai enemies from the DLC packs, which are also really cool. I think they added some really neat ones to fight. So while the story of the DLCs is pretty bad, the bosses and the enemies and some of the content there to run through is a lot of fun. So of course, don't ignore them completely and at least run through them one time. I think they're certainly worth that. Now, I want to speak a little bit about the Underworld, the end-game progression area, if you will. Similar to Nioh 1's Abyss, the Underworld is only available, though, in Dream of the Nioh. Functionally, though, it works a lot like the Abyss did. You see, you'll be transported to Terra Infirma, which is like the general hub area, and you can then go to the Netherscape. The Netherscape is a small explorable area where you're looking for 4 Kodama. Each of these Kodama you'll find will give you a buff that you can then take back to the main hub area to go to the Crucible to fight the boss for that level of the Underworld. Fighting that boss and defeating it allows you to delve deeper into the Underworld, fighting more bosses and taking on more challenges as you go as things ramp up in difficulty along the way, providing a long-term in-game progression, honestly, by simply reusing a lot of what you've seen up to this point. And I don't have a problem with this, let's be honest, ARPGs do this all the time. You see some sort of in-game progression based on this in basically every isometric ARPG these days. And it is, if you want to continue playing the game, the best place to grind out loot and levels. Though I will say for me, this is usually where I kind of just don't really feel like playing the rest of it because it's just bosses and enemies I've fought before, with them just adding different modifiers to the fight and changing it in small ways that I don't feel are really impactful, especially when I want to play all sorts of games and not just this one. So I think the Underworld is cool. It is a bit shorter than Nioh 1's. Nioh 1's Abyss was like 999 levels, whereas this one has 108 floors to the regular Underworld, and then after that there are 30 more floors called the Depths. But basically, if 5 full playthroughs of the game, the base game and its New Game Plus cycles, all of the DLC on all those levels aren't quite enough for you, there is still yet more end-game progression where you can work on and refine your build even further, which is a fantastic option for people, but for me, it's just where I lost interest because I had seen all of those things already. Which brings me to the Steam Deck section of this video as we get close to the end. Again, very similar to Nioh 1 here. The Steam Deck runs this pretty well. There's a couple options you'll probably want to adjust. I would turn off the shadows in particular. That seems to make a huge difference. And I've seen some reports from people that capping the frame rate a little bit under 60 for some reason helps this game out immensely. And if you do that, you can even get it on mostly high settings, running the game quite well. And given that most people prefer to play these on a controller, that's likely to be a much better experience for you even, with the game playing it remarkably well. Combine that with things like cloud saves, and I could see someone choosing to play this on the Steam Deck. Now, personally, this isn't the game I could play ever on that particular platform, but given the game's relatively low recommended specs and everything, it is very possible. Surprisingly so, even. The main thing to watch out for, realistically, I think, is if you just leave the default settings and don't mess around with them, you might run into some issues, but also the text, especially with all of the menus where you're looking at character stats and everything, can be a bit small. There is a text scaler that will help you out a little bit here, but it's not a ton. That said, if you are fine with the small text and everything, which gives the game its playable rating for Steam Deck officially, then I think you'll be good to go. Otherwise, you can play this game, I would say, pretty comfortably as far as these types of games go, which surprised even me. That, though, brings me to my positives and negatives before we start wrapping this up with the conclusion. Now, on the positive side of things, for me, the biggest positives were, as always, combat. As expected from the first game, combat delivers here. It's a fantastic system. I would encourage you to mess around with the different weapons, find what you like, and then don't be afraid to mess around with items and see what they can add into combat. Focus on different approaches, different yokai abilities, mess around with the yokai shift even, and find the things you're most comfortable with. And if you're willing to do that, the combat system of this game is fantastic. As far as third-person action RPGs go, I don't think it gets much better than this. So the refinements they made to those systems from Nioh 1, which was already incredibly dense and complicated, only serves that purpose even farther. It is such an incredible system that they somehow managed to make better in this game, and I can't sing the praises of that enough. It feels fun to play when you're not being destroyed by bosses too strong for you to be fighting, that is. Unfortunately, though, the negatives are mostly the negatives that Nioh 1 had, with a few exceptions. The bosses from the base game especially are incredibly boring. They reuse a lot of areas in the DLCs from prior games, just straight up ripping old missions and bringing them forward, and you're going to find yourself looking at a lot of those areas and missions just over and over again, especially over the course of all the New Game Plus cycles should you so choose. And while that's not an issue if you're only playing through the game once, it definitely gets old running through all the New Game Plus stuff, on top of having played Nioh 1, because I've seen a lot of this stuff from Nioh 1. In fact, a lot of the side missions and things from the DLC just straight up reuse bosses from the first game, which I honestly didn't care for much. Another thing that I think this game in particular could have used was some quality of life features. While they did a fantastic job improving the core features of Nioh 1, such as the combat, where they didn't improve things is just basic quality of life. You're getting tons of loot thrown at you. Most ARPGs these days come with a loot filter that this game desperately needed, and things like the soul matching system, while functional, could have been made a lot easier. And there's a lot of just flipping through menus to do basic things that gets old after a while, frankly. And I think a sequel would have been the place to clean those things up. And then last but not least, a complaint for almost every Souls-like really, a lot of times you're going to be fighting the camera rather than enemies, especially on larger boss fights. There were multiple boss fights where you have to be really careful, or you're going to be pushed up against a wall where suddenly the camera is terrible. There's a lot of small rooms where the camera does not really like you and it's not your friend. and it gets to be a hassle to deal with especially, and it's definitely worst when you're fighting the larger enemies. But all of that brings me to my conclusion. Nioh 2 is a resounding improvement over the first game that unfortunately also carries forward a lot of its problem areas, the asset reuse, the poor bosses, the lack of quality of life, the poor camera, and while those things are certainly annoyances, I wouldn't let them get in the way of the fact that in every other regard, Nioh 2 really moves the bar forward in some pretty substantial ways that I think make Nioh 1's combat, which was already really great, even better, which is the most remarkable thing this game does. So when it comes to a recommendation, you can pick this game up on Steam for $50 US, which comes with all of the DLC via the Complete Edition, and you can regularly find it on sale. And you could realistically play this game for hundreds of hours, and if you want to play this game for hundreds of hours, then $50 is a drop in the bucket in comparison. But even without that, you could also simply wait for this game to be on sale and get it for even cheaper and still do the same thing, as these days you can regularly find it on sale with Nioh 1 often, usually in the ballpark of $20. I bought both of these games at the same time in 2023 on sale for $40 total. And for that kind of price, even at full price, you can't really beat the value there if you enjoy these types of games. But when it comes to recommending it, if you enjoy these types of hard games, then Nioh 2 is fantastic. It's certainly prone to its frustrating moments, and I don't think this game is going to be the one to convince you to play this genre of games, certainly. But if you already are interested in these, I think it's a great one. And people's love for the title, even just a few years later, will certainly speak to that. But that is pretty much going to do it for this particular review. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think about this particular title down in the comment section below. But truly, thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.